Hello, this is the CUDAN Open Lab seminar on March 31st, 2025, and it is our greatest pleasure today to have Theresa Heyd from the University of Heidelberg. She will speak about Cringe, the sociolinguistics of digital affect. And personally, I need to sort of like mention why and how I found Theresa, who does fantastic work, which happened due to German television trying to hire a misogynist who they tried to hire, let's say, because they claimed it is anecdotal. And this was one of the moments in the 21st century where cultural data analytics sort of like found its purpose in doing something in 24 hours, not in like a year or 2 years or 3 years, because Theresa analyzed this kind of person in terms of like what they said consistently over a very long time and with linguistic methods. And that led to other qualitative researchers doing further research, doing a large podcast, and then German broadcasting system, and eventually not hiring that person. And I found that unbelievably impressive because it's sort of something you need to be prepared for in the same way you need to be prepared for if you know how to do RNA virus vaccines, but you don't know the virus yet, but in the moment when it happens, you're ready. And that is so cool. Theresa, this is sort of something which sort of like drew my attention to your work. And basically I found out that this is all super awesome. And so basically today we hear from you and I think your research group on Cringe, which is a sort of phenomenon that we're all exposed to increasingly so. I think a couple of days ago, the crazy ass moments in Italian politics account on Twitter was renamed into mildly interesting moments in Italian politics because what's happening in the US is so cringe. And so it couldn't be more timely. The stage is yours.
All right, good. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. I'm going to minimize my video screen, so if something happens with the audio or the video, you just need to kind of yell at me, okay? Right.
Okay.
Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for the kind invitation and to Maximilian for the very kind introduction. As you already pointed out, I'm a sociolinguist, so I'm interested in all kinds of phenomena that link language and society in the broadest sense, right? So the framework of your lecture series, cultural data analytics, feels very much at home for me. Specifically, I have a long-standing interest in my work in digital linguistic practice, again, of all kinds and sorts. And in my talk today, I want to explore connections between how we use language online in a general sense and recent theory building around the study of emotions, feelings, sentiment, etc. In other words, the digital sociolinguistics of affect. So this exploration of the sociolinguistics of digital affect is linked, as you already hinted at, in my case, to this very specific joint project that I'm currently engaged in, namely on the linguistics and aesthetics of cringe. Yeah? And as I hope to show in the next half hour or 40 minutes or so, that's how long I plan to present a few things. I want to show that cringe, I think, is a very intriguing case of digital affect. All right, so here is my outline for today's talk. I want to start out by situating digital affect a bit more broadly than cringe specifically. The example that I want to use for that is the so-called all the feels meme that some of you might be familiar with. After that, I will introduce just a couple of strands of theory on affect and affect theory, in particular what has come to be known in recent years as the so-called affective turn. And I really have to say that research on affect is such a multidisciplinary endeavor that you can fill entire libraries with it. I will try in as much as possible to keep it short and sweet. After that, I want to turn to cringe. I want to present a couple of key insights and ways of analyzing cringe. As maybe one short data point or case study, I want to consider selfies as one specific site for engagement with cringe as a digital affect. And at the end, I want to close by pointing out that my research on cringe is part of what we could see as an entire network of repertoires of digital affect, right? And as I said, this should take about 35 to 40 minutes. All right. Let's begin with a look at the big picture, not just cringe, but all the feels. Yeah? Let's begin with this screenshot here. This is a blog entry from the blog titled Words We Are Watching. This belongs to the Merriam-Webster website, Merriam-Webster being the major American lexicography publishing house. And this screenshot is not dated, but should be roundabout from 2017, so that you get an idea for where we are digital history-wise. Now, the blog that you're seeing is a typical metalinguistic genre of tracking and commenting on ongoing language variation and change. We will actually re-encounter this type of journalistic writing later on with regard to cringe. What we see here in this case is the specific entry at its topic, which is the construction all the feels, which is situated here as a typical form of digital linguistic usage. Now, Merriam-Webster being a lexicographer, this article is mainly interested in the morphological and structural linguistic aspects of the construction, all the feels. So specifically, it's interested in this linguistic reduction from feelings to feels. Yeah, this is a phenomenon that is called back-clipping in structural linguistics. And these kinds of abbreviations and shortenings are quite typical of early 2000s digital usage that became associated with phenomena like so-called lol speak and other forms of millennial digital usage. However, my point of entry to this is that all the feels is linguistically interesting, not just because of the linguistic structure of the construction, but also in terms of its usage contexts. So in digital linguistics, it is often possible to track the etymology and emergence of such constructions with a pretty high degree of precision. All right, and this is also the case for all the feels, which we can in fact trace pretty specifically to the image board communities such as 4chan and its derivatives in the late 2000s. So we are roundabout in 2008, 2009 for the emergence of all the feels. You can see this in the screenshot on the left-hand side here, where a user attests to kind of coining this usage. Interestingly, the emergence of all the feels can be traced to German and Polish image board users, yeah, so not Anglophone speakers. This may be one alternative explanation for the non-standard form feels rather than feelings, yeah, so it might actually be kind of a second language artifact happening there. Be that as it may, from 2010 onwards, the construction, all the feels, has become habitually connected to the image macro that you see here on the right-hand side of my slide. This image macro, this meme of a traced person, also called Wojak, the feels guy. Now, if you consider the mimic, the facial features of the person represented in this meme, we might not be quite so sure how to describe it in terms of emotion, in terms of affect. We might end up describing it as emotionally ambivalent, all right? So we see the furrowed brow, we see the raised eyebrows, we see the fixed gaze, we see these kind of pressed lips. All of this suggests maybe an affect of apprehension or worry, or perhaps even sadness, right? But one thing is certain, we see some kind of affect, of being affected by something. And interestingly, one of the canonical depictions of the meme is not an isolated figure, but precisely the representation which you see here in my slide, namely the image macro of two guys hugging each other in close bodily intimacy. I know that feel, bro. Right? So this origin, this digital nucleus in the image board community of the late 2000s has brought forth a semiotically rich and varied way of referencing emotions that continues to be used and that also continues to generate new digital linguistic practices. I've given you a few examples here. This includes, for example, related collocations, such as right in the feels. Yeah? It includes hashtags, such as hashtag feels, fixed constructions, such as that feel when X, right? Whatever. Acronyms, such as TFW, standing for that feel when, and of course, many, many memes and animated GIFs. So just by going with these kinds of usage patterns, we could already say that all the feels is a nice, perfect example of digital linguistic practice and the dynamics that we expect from it. So we have an example of a piece of digital vernacular. We find, as we can see here, semiotic variation and flexibility. We have transmission across different social media platforms and usage contexts. And also, as we saw, kind of being transmitted from this original image board community, we have spread across all kinds of different linguistic communities. As a sociolinguist, I take an interest in the construction beyond this sheer variability in usage. The image board of the late 2000s, as you might be aware of, were not just any kind of online community, but they were and are specifically associated with the enactment of very specific kinds of masculinity, often a young, aggressive, even antagonistic kind of masculinity that formed the breeding ground later on, for example, for anti-feminist online movements from Gamergate to later incel communities. And so my hunch is that it is no coincidence that all the feels emerged in this specific community and its usage becomes highly ambivalent. So from the digitally licensed and ironically layered possibility to talk about your own emotional vulnerability, right? I know that feel, bro, to stances of scorn and derision in the face of other users' display of affect. So this ambivalence between the need for closeness and solidarity on the one hand and distancing from displays of affect on the other hand fits in neatly, I think, with sociolinguistic insight into the language patterns of similar hyper-heterosexual communities, such as, for example, college fraternities. Okay, good. Be that as it may, today, the social meaning of all the feels transcends this masculine context of emergence. So much so, in fact, that we see all the feels commodified in the physical linguistic landscape. And so you will find shops and storefronts inscribed with all the fields, as you can see in my examples here, from Houston, Texas to Munich, from Nashville to small-town German Wiesbaden. And if you consider these contexts of usage, you may notice that here all the feels caters first and foremost to practices of consumption that are in fact quite coded as feminine, right? So interior design, childhood education, yoga, bridal dresses, etc. In these practices of consumption, the semantic domain of feeling has become regendered and kind of redomesticated, as it were. And we see this, by the way, all the way down to the fine typographic detail of the fonts, colors, imagery, etc. used here, a practice that sociolinguists have described as graphic variation as a social practice. Now, one thing we can actually question is whether the Merriam-Webster team was right in its words we're watching estimate that all the fields is actually becoming kind of a potential lexicographic entry, right? If you look at frequency patterns in corpus data, for example, you see this upwards curve, but then also a downwards curve. And so it seems possible and plausible that all the fields has come, but will also go away again, just like many items of digital usage have done, right? But regardless of this specific linguistic construction, we can take away a broader first insight about the sociolinguistics of digital affect. In other words, digital linguistic practice, when we look closely, is in fact steeped in discourse about affect and emotions. And this, as we have already caught a glimpse of, brings forth very specific and complex patterns of usage. So doing affect talk is an important and relevant and socially meaningful digital activity. But as we have seen in the masculine user communities of image boards, talking about your feelings online can also be a risky affair, linked to face loss, and is therefore, as a result, often couched in many layers of discursive irony and distancing. Okay, good. So this first linguistic data point has illustrated, so I hope at least, that it is worthwhile thinking about our practices of digital usage in terms of affect, right? I would now like to turn to an ever so brief glimpse into recent theory. So as I mentioned in my intro, scholarly insight into and reasoning around emotion spans many centuries, goes back into antiquity. It includes by now disciplines from philosophy to neurochemistry and beyond, right? So for reasons of brevity, I obviously can only and want to concentrate on one very tiny and very specific slice of the theory cake, so to speak. And the one I will focus on are constructivist understandings of affect that have emerged out of the humanities and social sciences disciplines in roughly the past 2 decades. Some of these go under the name or the umbrella of the affective turn. Now, whether we like that notion, whether we want to adopt it or not, some people say not yet another turn, please. Yeah. But regardless of that, I think these approaches provide an interesting and helpful framework for understanding affect at large, and also for my discipline specifically for understanding the sociolinguistics of digital affect, right? So I thought I could cherry pick 3 specific vantage points on the affective turn, coming from first sociology, then philosophy, and lastly, literary theory. Okay. Let's begin with sociology understood broadly, Margaret Wetherell's perspective from, yes, well, broadly speaking, the social sciences, social psychology, possibly also. In her 2012 book titled Affect and Emotion, A New Social Science Understanding, she really, I think, made a crucial contribution to the understanding of affect, specifically through her understanding of emotions as affective practice, right? And practice being the crucial term here. Here is a quick quote from her. I'll read it out. Affective practice focuses on the emotional as it appears in social life and tries to follow what participants do, right? Again, emphasis on doing. It finds shifting, flexible, and often overdetermined figurations rather than simple lines of causation, character types, and neat emotion categories. Now, this focus on performativity resonates very strongly with pragmatic theories of language use. And also, I guess anyone who has ever read a couple of pages of Judith Butler will similarly recognize this starting point of doing affect as a performative quality. And this also gels with Wetherell's discursive approach to understanding affect. Again, I quote, "Human affect is inextricably linked with meaning making and with the semiotic, broadly defined, and the discursive." And by the way, what we can also read between the lines here is a pretty harsh critique of cognitivist and biologist theories of emotion. For example, in Wetherell's critiquing formulation here of simple lines of causation, character types, and neat emotion categories. Yeah, so this is a little hint at biologists' approaches of defining emotion. All right, moving on to philosophy, and in particular, feminist philosophy. Sarah Ahmed may be the most well-known thinker of the affective turn. She's quite well known, for example, through her recent work, such as the so-called Feminist Killjoy Handbook. Ahmed's most fundamental contribution to a constructivist understanding of affect actually just recently turned 20 years old. It's her book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And in this book, and also later on, Ahmed's central argument is that emotions don't just kind of happen to us or happen within us or from our inside outward or something like this. She says that emotions are not societally naive, but that they circulate and become powerful in political constellations, and that they are a factor in erecting and securing societal hegemonies. Now, from the year 2025, from our present-day vantage point, this argument may feel a little bit like stating the obvious, right? So we are, after all, surrounded by entire election campaigns that are founded on hate and fear and resentment, etc. But Ahmed's book, which was written right in the wake of 9/11, and so under the immediate impression of post-9/11 societies, I think is really worth rereading for an understanding of how emotion is used to create these effective economies and their political dimensions. All right. My last theoretical point, the affective turn has also been part of literary theory, which is, as you might imagine, no stranger to theorizing sentiment and emotion. I want to highlight here the works of Xian Nai, whose work has included both the consideration of ugly feelings. That was the title of her 2005 book, in which she examined what she calls minor or unwanted forms of affect, such as irritation, for example, or anxiety. And then later on, her book from 2012, the title page of which you see here in my slide, called Our Aesthetic Categories, in which she looks at positively affirmed, but similarly peripheral affects, such as the cute and the zany. And I think this approach is particularly helpful for Nai's understanding of affect as what she calls vernacular aesthetics, by which she means, or that at least is the way I understand it, affect as a form of everyday aesthetic, and I quote, whose functions as judgment and as style relate to each other. And this, at least from my vantage point of sociolinguistics, resonates quite intensely with theoretical understandings of affect and style on the level of language and linguistic analysis. All right, I'll briefly sum up some of the points that we can take away from theorizing the affective turn. First, affect as practice and performance rather than an essentialized kind of naive emotion. Secondly, affect as political, in the sense of effective regimes, like with Sarah Ahmed, that govern societal hierarchies and semantics. And finally, affect as an aesthetic practice that rallies us into communities of taste and distinction. Right. Before we now, at last, turn to cringe as an ambivalent affect, all of this maybe raises the question, well, this is a talk about digital linguistic practice. How does the affective turn and its insights then relate to digital linguistic practice? Rereading and re-understanding online communication as a history of affect is actually the topic of a book I'm currently working on. And my central argument here is that affect is anything but a recent phenomenon in digital linguistic practice. Quite to the contrary, it is a factor of what we could call longue durée. It is one that we can identify in the earliest form of digital communication and that has developed through all platforms and socio-technical innovations and developments. To point you to just a few of these milestones, we can begin with the early digital linguistics of the 1990s, which back then was very strongly influenced by the theory of the internet as a so-called lean medium. Yeah, where the idea was that the lack of multimodal cues and basically the needing to rely on textual means basically meant that textual expression was needed for effective nuance. Yeah, so that people used the textual means that they had in order to express affect. For example, through capitalization, remember writing in all caps, or the use of excessive punctuation, or also alternatively no punctuation. And of course, also, as you can see in this title here by Brenda Dennett, through the use of early emoticons, right? The second phase of digital communication history begins around the mid-2000s with the emergence of the so-called social web and the spread of social networks, Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and many others. In these networks and in these social media environments, effective networking and what Zapavinia, for example, has called ambient affiliation through communicative practices such as liking, friending, sharing, hashtagging, etc., were constitutive for affect marking in this period. And finally, the recent decade is increasingly marked by post-humanist discourse, where we engage increasingly with non-human or not quite human entities, such as algorithms, digital assistants, bots, and the like, and where we increasingly do effective performance with them and through them, and as some linguists have argued, sometimes also for them, for their benefit, right? So these are some of the more recent steps of digital linguistic effective practice. All right, with a bit of history and a bit of theory in place, let's at last turn to a quite specific, ugly feeling, as it were, namely the feeling of cringe. Now, when I give face-to-face seminars, preferably together with students about the topic of cringe, what we usually do is that we start out with a bit of collective brainstorming. So what do we actually consider to be cringe? What does it feel like when something is cringe-worthy, etc.? So I have a growing collection of examples of this kind. For example, what my students tell me, cringe is when you are walking somewhere on the sidewalk and someone waves at you from the distance and you wave back to them, and only later do you realize that they were waving at someone else. Yeah, that's uncomfortable. Or other example, you are at a party and at the beginning of the evening, you forget to ask the name of someone you have been talking to. And now for the rest of the evening, you need to navigate that kind of name gap in a certain way. Yeah, can be very uncomfortable. as well. So these are some examples of real-life cringe that my students have mentioned. Maybe you have good examples of your own. If so, I'm always eager and interested to hear them. Now, my work on cringe is situated, we have hinted at this, in a 2-year joint project that is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. I'm engaged in this together with my colleague Heide Volkening from the University of Greifswald. And in this project, we consider cringe both as a discursive practice, so that's kind of my area of expertise, and also as a literary and cultural aesthetic. So this is a collaboration between English sociolinguistics on the one hand and German literary theory on the other hand. It is also strongly influenced by our previous collaborations around topics of gender studies. And I mentioned this so explicitly because it really seems to me that in the context of this specific lecture series, it is worth repeating the worth of such transdisciplinary work for the humanities and social sciences. I really candidly believe that we do the best kind of work in such interdisciplinary settings, where we are allowed to learn from each other. All right, so how can we theorize cringe? For my work, basically in whichever facet I look at, it ends up being a triangulation of these 3 following aspects. First, maybe kind of obviously, I'm interested in cringe as a digital and discursive practice. This includes, but is not limited to, genres such as cringe comedy, or as you can see here in this snippet, try not to cringe compilations. But of course, I'm also interested in metalinguistic uses of the word, in digital reactions and other kind of metalinguistic utterances. Secondly, cringe is always bound to forms of sociolinguistic embodiment, right? So the very etymology of the word cringe, which is traceable right up to Old English around the turn of the millennium, implies bodily reaction. Yeah, and so digital cringe reactions, from animated GIFs to emojis, etc., still encapsulate this bodily aspect of cringe. And finally, my focus of today's talk, cringe is always a linguistic rendering of effective practice, be it as an affect of experiencing yourself as cringe, or as a meta-discursive marker for the linguistic practice of others. All right. So what kind of an affect is cringe then? I'm showing you here one popular scientific approach by Melissa Dahl, who focuses very strongly on the self-reflexive aspect of cringe. So I won't read out this quote, but the affective repertoire she invokes in it includes factors such as awkwardness, an unpleasant kind of self-recognition, and a forced moment of self-awareness. And by the way, if you look at the snapshot of her cover, of her book cover that I've given you here, you see a nice case of the embodiment of cringe here, in this case, through this traced face palm gesture here. Yeah, so cringe as something embodied through gesture. All right, so awkwardness, disappointment, your own self-recognition, etc. However, my colleague and I want to make the suggestion that an explanation of cringe that zooms in only on shame and awkwardness does not capture cringe quite in full. And so this is why we center on this idea of cringe as an ambivalent affect. We're not the first ones to suggest this. There are precursors to this idea. For example, Duncan has described cringe comedy, such as Curb Your Enthusiasm or The Office, as squirm comedy. And Schwanebeck uses the term painful laughter for these kinds of genres. I want to argue that there is something about these ambivalent practices of intriguing disgust that works particularly well in digital contexts. Think of other practices of digital consumption. Wait a second, please. Okay, sorry. Think of other practices of digital consumption. We watch, for example, oddly satisfying videos, or we talk about guilty pleasures, right? So you have things that are satisfying, but in an odd way, or you have pleasures, but you consume them in a guilty manner. Or finally, we engage in hate reading. Yeah, so reading, supposedly a pleasurable form of consumption, but we do this with an affect of hate. This is, for example, when you scroll through social media pages of people you find really stupid and kind of engage in kind of intrigue, disgust, or something like this, right? So this ambivalent affect of our project title, namely Schamlust, which you could translate as something like the pleasure of shamefulness, is a bit of a tip of the hat to what Sigmund Freud in his theories calls Angstlust. Yeah, so the pleasurable aspect of fear, which is yet another ambivalent affect that we are quite familiar with from, for example, consuming horror movies and the thrill that comes with that, or also the ambivalent pleasure of roller coaster rides. Okay, outside the Anglosphere, for example, in my native Germany, linguistic usage patterns of cringe get connected to the sociological variable of age. Yeah, so lifespan and life age. Cringe is associated specifically with youth language and gets to be interpreted as a practice of doing age, in particular as a form of generational identity work and kind of insulation or buffering against older generations. Right. However, we have to say that this association with youth language is closely connected and, in fact, furthered by very intensely journalistic meta-discourse. You see a screenshot here. In the German case, it was actually the so-called Youth Word of the Year competition in the year 2021 by the Langenscheidt Company, which is yet another lexicographic publishing house. Yeah, maybe no coincidence, which elected the word cringe as the youth word of the year 2021. And this very high-profile journalistic process probably had a very heavy hand in the public perception and popularity of the term cringe in German. In this sense, cringe becomes commodified, and very successfully so. Yeah, cringe becomes a very useful marketing tool when you need a bit of youthful cachet for your product. Yeah, so what you see here is once more the Langenscheidt publishing house. You see it with the little yellow and blue L there. Yeah, so it worked very well for them, capitalizing on cringe, but it also worked for other platforms. So, for example, the high-profile national nightly news, the Tagesschau, depicted here with their anchor woman, Susanne Daubner, or also for commercially very successful German podcasts here, for example, under the ironic label Boomer Cringe. Right? So all of these examples show us that cringe can be harnessed quite successfully for the aggregation of communities of age and taste. Okay, one final linguistic data point. At least for the German language, cringe is a zone of contact, not just for generations, as we have just seen, but also for languages, through, in this case, borrowing from English to German. So while we can trace the etymology of cringe to the 13th century in English, it is a quite recent phenomenon in Germany. Yeah, you can see it on the left-hand side on my slide here in this kind of hockey stick curve in German corpus data, which takes off in the late 2010s, basically. And this very stark increase in popularity is not matched in English corpus usage data from the same period of time. Okay, and finally, also in terms of word classes, cringe is extremely flexible in German. So it can easily morph into a verb, but also a noun, an adjective, and even a kind of sort of all-purpose discourse marker. And again, this is a property that is quite typical for English words in English. Yeah, so we are quite familiar with this, but it is a somewhat noteworthy flexibility in the German language. So again, cringe proves to be a quite intense language contact phenomenon. Okay. Good. So this was an overview about some linguistic approaches that we can take to cringe as a digital affect. And I hope I have a few minutes left, and I would like to use them in closing by illustrating the cringe of digital practice in a little bit more of an immediate way, so to speak, namely with one domain that we as a team keep encountering, not just in the sociolinguistic literature, but also in cringe anecdote that our students and other people tell us, and that is the practice of selfies. Selfie taking, but also selfie sharing, talking about selfies, the entire practice, right? So as an outlook, so to speak, let's talk a little bit about some of the sociolinguistic aspects of selfies in general and why they can be so cringe specifically, right? So I don't know about you, about anyone who listens to this, but for me, as basically an elder millennial, I have to say that I am guilty as charged when it comes to selfies. I did this experiment last year together with my students, a little bit of autoethnographic observation, if you will, quite interesting experiment. We scrolled through our camera rolls on our phones and observed what we were seeing in terms of selfie practices, right? And it turns out that for me, I seem to be taking selfies more or less at every given moment, right? I do so with my children, with my friends. I do it as the naily or selfie variant, as an outfit check, for showing off, when I feel good, when I feel bad, and sometimes just because. Now, that's quite a bit of oversharing in an academic talk, isn't it? A little bit uncomfortable to look at all these selfies right in the middle of thinking about sociolinguistics. It certainly feels a bit uncomfortable for me. It kind of makes you appreciate this ambivalent notion of Schamlust. So we may ask ourselves, what is the deal with the high cringe potential of selfies? Historically speaking, as you can see here, self-portraits are, of course, nothing new. We encounter them in art history long before these examples I'm showing here, for example, by Frida Kahlo. Probably we can say that the first cave paintings could be understood as self-portraits of some sort. Now, importantly, as you can see in these examples, self-portraits often involve the engagement with some kind of technical apparatus and thus technological mediation in the broadest sense. We see this, for example, in the early mirror selfies here by Vivian Maier, or also the Polaroid art of Andy Warhol. And if you think back to my timeline of the history of digital linguistic practice earlier on, we can actually locate self-portraits on there from early on. So again, selfies are not a recent practice, but people have been doing this basically since the internet was around with digital means, right? For example, the commercial availability of webcams in the 1990s led to very early live streaming projects. Maybe someone still remembers this. The case I'm showing here is JennyCam in the early 1990s. Yeah. Later on, we have the wide usage of digital cameras, so digital cameras, right, not smartphones, in the early 2000s, which paved the way for very early selfie formats. What you see here in the middle, you might have recognized her, is none other than a very young Taylor Swift, who posted this picture on her MySpace account back then. And this finally led up to the genreification of selfies in the way that we know them until today. This example on the right-hand side here, I'm sure many of you are still familiar with the iconic group selfie by Ellen DeGeneres at the Oscars 2014. So if you consider this, selfies fit nicely into the cringe triangle I showed earlier. We have an intensely discursivized digital practice that is used in a fundamental way for the representation of bodies, and it is about affect management, so affect as a form of doing face work in more than one sense. And indeed, framing selfies as cringe, as embarrassing or discursively problematic and even worthy of derision is a very long-standing meta-discourse. It has basically been around for as long as selfies have been around. So people who take selfies are seen as being suspicious of being vain, being shallow, of taking up public space, even of being grifters. Right? And so digital language ideologies about selfie taking and selfie posting follow a long arc from derisions of duckface in female selfie takers to selfie sticks as kind of scandalous objects to annoying TikTokers in public space. And so we find evidence of anti-selfie linguistic prescriptivism that is affect-laden to the point of personal aggression. The snippet I'm showing you here is not our own data. This is from a paper by Carlquist et al. 2019. This was an ethnographic study amongst young users of Snapchat, so yet another social media platform. And in this excerpt, a group of young people is discussing selfie taking in public. And as you can see when you read through this excerpt, selfies in public are not only marked as cringe, you see this down here in line 29, Michael using this word, but also with other very effectively charged and even antagonistic language. So selfie takers are described as strange, as not normal, as nasty, and the people who do it are described as what a jerk. And what I found interesting, if you turn to line 21, the lone female participant in this discussion group here, Lisa, reacts in a kind of hesitant way to this positioning by asking, okay, so it's not normal? Yeah. We can glean from this little excerpt the enormous cringe potential of selfies and the ambivalent affect they provoke. And sociolinguistic research has found ways of modeling the ambivalent face work associated with selfies. Georgiakopoulou 2016 analyzed the mitigation of positive face in her study on selfie practices among English teenagers. She focused on the conversational work that accompanies the posting of selfies. Yeah, so what happens basically after a selfie is posted. And she described this as ritual appreciation. And you can see this in this little data snippet on the left-hand side. A young woman has posted a selfie, which is actually not shown here. And what we see here, however, is her friends affirming the act of posting the selfie. Right? So stunning, so hot, beyond beaut, etc. And Maria, the poster, reacting, oh, thank you, heart emoji. Right? So this is one side of the coin. Selfies can function in the positive affect of sharing your body and the discursive affirmation that follows. By contrast, page 2019 focuses on the risky potential of selfies. Simply put, selfie sharing can be seen to violate pragmatic rules of what has been called discursive modesty. Yeah? So what if my selfie fails to attract appreciation? Not just because people don't like it, but because they don't like me and the act of posting it. Yeah, because my posting the selfie might be perceived as an act of vanity and even shallowness. In the data that Page presents, the users navigate this discursive risk by using the hashtag, you can see it on the right-hand side here, the hashtag ugly selfie. Something that Page describes as digital speech act of self-denigration. And so this effective practice of posting a selfie, but doing so with claims to anti-beauty, allows in turn for face-affirming reactions, for example, by playful engagement with the self-denigrating positioning or through affirmative face work. No, you're not ugly, you look amazing as a reaction, right? Okay, I need to get to the end. I can only say that remains to be done in the area of selfies and cringe. In ongoing work, Iris Benchik and myself are investigating ongoing change in the everyday aesthetics of selfies, as they are influenced by a number of aspects, not the least of one of them being platform trends and socio-technical change, for example, through the emergence of platforms such as Be Real and their very specific posting practices. All right, good. A very brief conclusion before I'm done. The notion of cringe itself may already have become dated. Yeah, when I ask my children, they tell me nobody says cringe anymore. So cringe as a digital affect may vanish in the near future, just like other waves of digital linguistic practice have come and gone. But to come back to my starting point, I want to suggest that digital repertoires of affect marking seem to be a kind of natural resource, which is kind of regrowing, as it were. So even if you are not a linguist, you just kind of need to keep an open eye and ear for current lexicogrammatical trends of digital linguistic practice. And then you will find things such as giving side eye or feeling the ick. Yeah, we find things such as referring to aesthetics, to so-and-so core, which can mean everything from norm core to ballet core to goth core and beyond. We find Riz standing for charisma. We find reference to vibes, or from last summer, people being demure. We find talk about aura and the like. And we also find syntactic constructions, such as so-and-so is a whole mood, it's giving X, or what we could call the Swiftism, being in my X era again for a certain affective disposition. And so in this sense, I remain convinced that there is much to be explored about digital affect. And I hope that I could show you a brief glimpse into what the sociolinguistic study of this domain may involve. With this, I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you very much.
Super cool. Thank you very much. So yeah, this was amazing. I've noted quite a number of things down which I would like to ask, but I'm pretty sure there will be other people in the audience who also have questions. Anybody wants to go first?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Related to the very last thing, Theresa, that you said, thank you so much for your talk. This is very close to what I study, memes and self-representation online. The question is, the memes die faster than I write papers. So how do I get sense of the internet in this reality?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part. So it's about the brevity of and the dynamics of change, you mean?
Exactly. So how do I study this when it evolves so fast?
Yeah, it's really it's on the one hand, of course, a question of method, right? So how do you kind of slice out or carve out a moment in time to study? Which I think there are ways of handling this by just saying, I'm going to look at the frame of so-and-so to so-and-so. What I find coming from digital linguistics on a more theory-based plane, and something that I have to say I'm kind of grappling with, is this notion of what I've been describing as presentism. Yeah, so we feel a very strong urge in analyzing digital linguistic practice or digital cultural practice to say, oh, it's also very recent and it's also developing anew, and we always have to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what is happening right now. Yeah, and so there's a sense of we need to be attending to everything that is going on right now, which if you looked at my slides with, you know, the timeline and the longue durée argument, I'm beginning to feel that we should say, well, no, actually, you know what, we can do media histories of digital practice, of digital linguistic practice. It's not harmful, but in fact insightful for understanding what the internet does, or we do on the internet, to understand, you know, what was going on 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. So my call to arms, so to speak, is to say, let's look at old stuff. Yeah, let's not be intimidated by things that get outdated fast. Yeah, so I mean, as I said, cringe is something that people won't be talking about in a couple of years, but I hope that some of the insights we can glean from it are will maybe continue to be insightful. Yeah, so that's the more theory-oriented kind of issue that I have with this. I don't know if it resonates with what you work on, or whether that helps. Yeah.
That resonates really well, and maybe related to this question is some of the memes, they originate from the domains that researchers try not to go sometimes, like 4chan and 8kun and all these insult platforms. How to deal with that, because I feel like being stripped from these ugly, so to say, platforms, they would get a different meaning in regular social media. So we are telling only one story, basically.
Sorry, it's a bit hard to understand because the acoustics in your room, I think, is not perfect. I understood the first part. So these they originate from potentially problematic platforms, but I didn't quite catch the question.
Oh, yeah. So the question is, if we don't look at these platforms, then we are telling one side of the story, basically, and we are losing the context in the making.
Yeah, I mean, this is I think this is a big ongoing debate, at least in the field that I work in. So the question, should we work with potentially problematic actors, data, contexts? I think for the most part, the answer to this is yes, we should. No, we cannot leave it out. But the question is more one of basically research ethics and data ethics, right? So how do we do so in a responsible way? How do we do so so as to, for example, not to reproduce extremist, harmful, hurtful practices and kind of examples and items. What I see happening in particular in critical sociolinguistics a lot is that people work with these data but frame them in a critical way, and also when there is specifically problematic material. I mean, this refers, for example, to slurs, etc., that these get blurred out. Yeah, so that we can say we need to find a way of working with problematic or potentially problematic data without giving them an uncritical platform or kind of reproducing them in an uncritical way. And I think that's not always easy, but I think actually in terms of research ethics, it's a super interesting and also worthwhile discussion to be had to kind of, do some self-reflective work on methods and kind of the boundaries of what we can do and what kind of data we want to look at. And maybe one final point, this may not always be relevant, but I know that people are working on this, the question of what are we ourselves exposing ourselves to. right? So we may say, oh, well, we can, we're tough, we can take looking at unpleasant things, etc. But I have a number of colleagues who work, for example, on data precisely from the so-called manosphere, who look at the incel community, etc., and who deal with kind of being steeped all day long in these very, very toxic data. Yeah. And so there's a debate to be had about how do we engage in what could be called kind of academic self-care around that, so that we don't get affected too much by this. Yeah. So this is maybe one more aspect that may be worth thinking about there. Mm.
Can I extend that question a little bit? There is basically people, when they look at genocide data and stuff like that, they're exposed to things like that, right? If you filter out content, say, in the non-existing departments of Facebook that filter out such content. So there is a thing where there's at least 3 different parties going on. Like there is the ones that you just sort of like included all of us, where we say, okay, we want to actually deal with this in a sort of manner that sort of like, takes into account the well-being of the audience, of the researcher, and ideally not perpetuating this as like sort of like examples of practice, right? So it's a little bit like, if you have, sort of like, if you do a horror movie, that may actually, the old argument that this may actually inspire somebody to do something like the thing you show in a horror movie. But then there's these 2 other things, which is, on the one hand, you have the people who have to deal with it. Like, for example, the ones who are the moderators of forums and actually have to ban stuff and so on, and come up with sort of like, sort of like self-governance. And then the third thing is the malintent. Like, there's people who basically do this kind of research, how to do persuasion and propaganda, with the sort of like worst means since way before Joseph Goebbels, and that made it into television research. How do you actually sell stuff? And things like Parler or Truth Social, whatever. I mean, these are not sort of like, stupid ideas. They are well designed in order to fulfill a really evil and awful purpose. And there, we may not have the luxury of not looking at it, because it affects so many people, and indeed, since a couple of weeks, sort of leads to people being deported. It's crazy, right? And so that is sort of something like, how do you deal with that? Like, is there a way where, we just have to sort of like find ways where people have to do the awful work, basically, in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, talking about a digital economy, you pointed to this. I mean, as researchers, we are probably in a very comfortable position in the sense that we can, at least to a certain degree, make decisions about what we consume and what we work with, etc. So if you look at the economy of content moderation, for example, these are jobs that have, for a large part, for example, been outsourced to sub-Saharan Africa, where entire communities are basically traumatized from reading hurtful Facebook content all day long and having to filter this. Yeah. I mean, this is something that, where I can only say, for a critical sociolinguistics, this is something that we need to be aware of, and that we, in our dealing with this kind of content, that we should alert our readers, and kind of the context in which our research happens, that we should make visible. Of course, there are limits to what we can do about it, I guess, right? But it's, I think, as you said, important to have all of these aspects of who takes part in, let's say, hateful content as, let's say, a communicative process with a number of actors involved, to kind of be aware of this and yeah, to make it visible. I think that's a very, very important point that you raise. Yeah.
One other thing I would like to bring up is you brought a frequency distribution where you have seen a rise and not quite fall to oblivion of cringe in the relative frequency. You've also shown sort of this exponential rise of cringe in Germany. And you mentioned this word longue durée, which I had to smile because I'm an art historian, and 1990 is basically that's sort of like 15 years after art historians classically stop looking. So basically, traditionally, longue durée à la Braudel would be a flat distribution, like the classic example is Barcelona's at the sea, and that doesn't change. But actually, I think you have a really cool point here, because as the amount of material of cultural production is growing exponentially, one could argue that, like, since 1990, a substantial 2-digit percentage of stuff has happened. And as such, 1990 to 2025 is a really longue durée, because you get like a third of the material. And so that is a really, really interesting thing. But it also raises this question that once you have this thing going on, your longue durée is not a flat distribution. It's subject to vigorous exponential growth of amount of stuff that becomes your corpus on the web. And I think that is a really interesting thing, because that your rise and fall, is that they trended against this exponential growth, for example? That is a really interesting question. So instead of like, is there an onset in the late 2010s? Factually, basically, Cringe, if you take that exponential growth as the baseline, doesn't exist at all before. And then the key question is the slope faster or slower than the general exponential growth? So in other words, is it a local phenomenon within the Cringe crowd, so to speak? I didn't pick up this word. Or is that something where you could say it actually is taking over a substantial fraction of the sort of like general global population of online discourse?
Right. So maybe two ways of answering this. So the first one is, of course, that my use of longue durée is more than a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? But it is precisely aimed at what we were talking about earlier, this notion, which I find not very helpful, of presentism in digital linguistics, which is only ever focused on the most recent thing to happen, and always focuses on, you know, digital culture and practice being perched for the next big thing, etc. And so this somewhat joking use of longue durée is precisely kind of the suggestion that we might look at historical contexts, even for something that is perceived to be so such a present-day thing as digital practice. From a linguistic point of view, it's not absurd. We often talk about what we would call micro-diachronic kind of time frames. Yeah, so that we say, yes, we want to look at something as it has developed, but as opposed to traditional historical linguistics, where you might look at a development from Old English through Middle English to early modern English or something like that, you can also look at meaningful cultural linguistic changes in a time span of 20 years or something like this, right? So this is maybe about the longue durée part. What is happening actually with these frequencies for Cringe? We have to be a bit careful there. So I kind of hinted at this. At least part of what we see with this very impressive hockey stick in German Cringe usage is mitigated through what I refer to this kind of meta-discursive journalistic discourse. Yeah, so it's kind of a I don't want to say it's not an artifact. Yeah, I wouldn't call it an artifact, because usage is usage, even if it's meta-discursive usage and even if it's journalistic. But it is something that is at least very, very intensely mediated. Yeah, so in those contexts, we need to be a bit careful about saying, oh, everyone in Germany is saying Cringe now. Certainly not. Yeah, and or at least it would be very hard to kind of to quantify this based on these kinds of data. But what we can see is that we have this cultural moment happening to Cringe. And I think what is noteworthy is that this did not happen in this form in Anglophone data, simply because Cringe had been there before. It would be interesting to look at other non-Anglophone languages like French, for example. I think we might see something similar there. Yeah.
Interesting. So before we go to Mark, I would like to add something. You said like one of the three authors you were citing is skeptical of sort of biologic and cognitive notion of emotion, which is interesting because it seems like there is a sort of more social interaction sort of like focus as opposed to an internal simulation focus, because you know the you know ecologists slash cognitivists would say we also simulate the real world in our brains or and as such, and biological entities do that too. And one of the interesting things where this may become interesting is exactly what you just said. If you have an exponential growth going on that is mediated, then you can actually ask yourself the questions like, how does that actually come to be? And that may very well be an enzymatic process, right? Where like it's used in the media, and through the media, it's used in public, and through the public use, it's used in even more media. And so it becomes self-perpetuating. And that kind of enzymatic process would actually be a sort of fundamental pattern, so to speak. The exponential growth is not just like an effect of like so many people being there, but there is an actual generating mechanism. And I think that is a really interesting thing, because in culture, these are really, really hard to observe, right? It's much easier to look at sugar molecules in a cell, basically. And so this is a really, really cool example, which like, even if your theorists don't believe in it, I will keep in mind as one of these things that smells a lot like biology.
Yeah. There would be a lot to say about this. I spent the better part of the winter reading all of these books by Wetherill and others. So my hunch is, I can't speak for them obviously, but my hunch is that they would agree with everything you've just said about circulation, transmission, etc. But this is not what, for example, Margaret Wetherill has in mind in this critique of biologist models of emotion. So very briefly, the critique is aimed at what I would call probably simplistic, essentialist, also a bit reductionist models of emotions. And I didn't have time to go into this, but there is a tradition coming out of mid-20th century biology, which has been taken up, interestingly, for example, in computational linguistics, in fields such as sentiment analysis, where there is a tendency to see emotions as neatly categorizable kind of entities, and this is then underscored by cognitivist categories, but also by, I don't know, endocrinological and other kind of biological theories, where you say, so you have this emotion, and then you have that emotion, and you have that emotion, and emotion A gets triggered by this, and emotion B gets triggered by that, and you can basically put them into nice and neat pigeonholes. And I'm oversimplifying and of course maybe ridiculizing it a little bit, but this is the kind of approach to affect theory that I think my theorists that I presented here would object to, and which is, however, not just a caricature. So again, if you read, for example, papers that use quantitative sentiment theory, then you find these kinds of simplistic emotion theories where, you know, you have a catalog of emotions, and then you kind of pin these emotions to different utterances or adjectives, etc. And linguistics is a bit complicit in kind of furthering this. This is why I'm maybe so extra critical of it. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Sure, totally. Mark.
Yeah, thank you for the exciting talk. And actually, what you just finished on was pretty much what I wanted to ask. So all I can do is comment, kind of. So this is actually like the reductionist models of emotions that you can often see in the more computational studies. Also in computer science, right? Especially the stance detection and sentiment analysis, that sort of that I've fallen in the same sort of pot myself, that in the end is just sort of benchmarking something, that how well it works, but actually you get really look at that deep understanding, maybe what kind of stances or emotions are in there. And my actually example myself was that I talked to someone who was researching sort of topics of not cringe but fringe more, and sort of queerness, for example. And that in one news source it might be explicitly against some groups, cultural groups, the stance, and the other cases seem, if you look at the sort of sentiment or stance, it's as if it's supportive, but then it misses the point that actually the vocabulary that might be used, it might be sort of looking down upon, actually. So I mean, the thing is that for me it doesn't mean that the sort of computational approach, if you want to do it at scale, it doesn't have value. But then it's maybe you just want to ask more, right? That okay, but what are the if you look at in terms of sort of binaries, maybe indeed good or bad, what are the other binaries in there? Actually, there is way more of these variables you wanna look into, and but it was great. You brought it out already yourself. But do you see do you see it as a problem, actually, like a white problem, or yeah?
Sorry, I was following you right until the last question. Can you frame the question?
So do you see it as a sort of a big problem, actually, yourself, that people are following this, or it's just a trend you note? Or
Yeah. Good question. I'm not quite sure. I mean, what you do see is, I mean, sentiment analysis is a thing that became fashionable maybe 15 years ago or so. I mean, you do see that such methods often seem to be quite attractive also for applied contexts, everything from marketing to big scale data analysis, etc. And so it's just my sociolinguistic impulse to say, we should be maybe a bit critical, a bit skeptical about this, yeah. And I think the examples that I showed are actually maybe illustrative examples of how such simplistic approaches, or I don't want to say simplistic, but these very clear-cut ideas of what an emotion is, that they may not be helpful, right? And we don't need to turn to cringe, but we can think about stuff like, I mean, think about these oddly satisfying videos, yeah? It's a huge market. There are hundreds of thousands of YouTube videos with millions of viewers. What kind of an affect is that? Yeah, it doesn't fit on a nice wheel of good or bad emotion. Yeah, and so my impulse is that we need to think about this in more nuanced and layered terms. Yeah. So yeah, as to your question, is it a big problem? Maybe because it's so seductive for applied settings. Yeah, but
yeah, actually, even like if you take Ekman's 6 emotions, what are really widely applied, then it's it's taken from a bit different field than computational text analysis or so on. So actually, it's sort of become standard, and also it's what standardizes it even more, that it's you have already annotated, it's easily applicable computationally, right? So it's like supervised training method. So it becomes popular because it's approachable, although it might not be the best way always. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
You, Mikhail. Yeah, sure. 1 second.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a fascinating talk, and a lot of. And I had a sort of a meta question because you presented this set of very interesting sort of qualitative insights, and my question is, do you see any sort of space for some sort of quantitative data analysis in further studying these things? What sort of data and what sort of methods, maybe?
Right. I mean, I didn't show these data today, but one of the more obvious ways of looking at this is through corpus linguistic data. What we have been doing, for example, is to look at what we have described as embodied cringe reactions, where we have we are currently in the process of working with 3 data sets from what used to be known as Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where we look at what kinds of cringe reactions people use based on a couple of different and sometimes specific parameters, right? So what kinds of emojis are used in conjunction, so standing next to cringe reactions, what kind of animated GIFs people use, and what kind of embodied language, so stuff like I died of cringe, etc. Yeah, and so this is one way in which we look at this. In, let's say, the traditional quantitative framework of linguistics, namely by in this case not using existing corpus data. So the couple of corpus snapshots I show today are from existing open access corpora that you can use. What we are currently doing is kind of compiling our own kind of bespoke cringe corpora, and these are things that yeah, that can be done and that we are doing and working with. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Anna.
Don't hear you yet. Your mic is off.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. My question is related a bit more to qualitative research aspects. Have you researched the reason for cringe, meaning cringe as an excuse not to discuss underlying topics? In my surveillance of social media trends and cringe online, I have seen it being used as a shortcut to not deeper discuss what actually makes a video cringe. To us, for example, people's own insecurities that makes them think another person that's not being insecure in this particular area is cringe, like as a way of projecting. Have you thought about that?
That's an interesting thought. At first I thought it doesn't really resonate, or I'm not quite seeing what you're getting at. But so you mean in some kind of what we could maybe call projection or something like that? Well, that's at least, let's say, a discourse that I've come across in conjunction with cringe and gender, yeah, which is a topic that I almost did not touch upon today, but one that you find, for example, in discussions of cringe and gender identity, of trans identities, for example, where aspects of, for example, trans visibility, yeah, passing, clocking, being visible in a wanted or unwanted way, have been described in terminologies of cringe, yeah, and so where you find some kind of meta-discursive or meta-linguistic reflections of that. And so, yes, I think I see what you mean, and I don't know if it's, let's say, really a dominant thing that is globally present across all kinds of cringe discourses, but it certainly is something that gets activated, and it's not a coincidence that you know, negotiations of gender kind of bring this to the fore. I don't know if you were thinking about other specific kinds of contexts or more globally.
Yeah, I'm a gender linguist, so that's my perspective too, but I think it's visible in any discriminatory theme. I think classism is often a topic in cringe videos, that we find them cringe because we are we're seeing classistic, I don't know, themes, and we feel better that we're not them and not having their lifestyle, and then we can label it off as cringe and not further educate ourselves or engage in a way, why is that person displaying that lifestyle, this life?
Yeah. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and in particular when we are talking about class and kind of buffering against certain lifestyles or certain contexts of belonging. This is something that we see very strongly, that my colleague and I have looked at, for example, in the case of the output of one particular German Instagrammer. And this is, I referred briefly to the notion of communities of taste, right? Geschmacksgemeinschaften in German. This is really one core aspect of what people do discursively with cringe. You could say it's kind of basic Bourdieu, right? So it's kind of making a distinction, in particular in cases of taste, or under the other way around, class understood through taste, obvious, and saying I'm not like that person, and by marking something as cringe, I'm kind of buffering against these kinds of lifestyles or practices. This is very central to a lot of what we're seeing in some of these digital practices.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is super interesting. Let me continue here. So there is a sort of let me open it with this sort of like observation of Gerhard Polt, who said, über Geschmack lässt sich nicht streiten, über keinen Geschmack schon. Meaning you cannot debate taste, but you can debate no taste. And so basically one of the interesting things with this cringe thing is that it is used as something becomes salient to be discussed, right? So what you just mentioned, like if something doesn't quite fit, right? Like if Andy Warhol in drag is visible as a male, then it is all of a sudden subject to discussion. I mean, it's in the caption of the picture, in drag. I mean, it could be just, why doesn't it just say self-portrait of Andy Warhol? His other wigs are not any better too, right? So, I mean, you see what I mean? So this is sort of like really, really difficult, I think. And I think this, thank you for mentioning that you didn't go into this dimension, but there is a whole dimension regarding this. I think it would actually be useful to have this kind of discussion, because actually it can be generalized. And let me give you an example. This notion of Schamlust, right? To sort of like have an appetence for being sort of like shamed. This is sort of something where there is huge crowds of people who have erotic kinks for being ashamed of something. While at the same time, there is also things like that are way more general. Like, let me give you an example. I'm a multidisciplinary researcher. We had actually a PhD student-run conference last week, which was about like interdisciplinarity. Where does it go? And a gender theorist actually debated about how their own experience basically sort of like actually resembles the situation in interdisciplinary research. And I think that is something that is really, really true. Like if I just, zoom back to my own 5-year-old self who knew a little bit too much about animals and ducks and whatever, I was constantly ridiculed by grown-ups who thought it's cringe that a 5-year-old knows this kind of stuff and it's completely useless and so on, particularly in a non-academic environment. And ever since, and it started back then, I have learned that whenever people start laughing, like whenever they cringe about what I'm doing, I'm in a good way, because what I'm doing is really new, because they're really not used to it. And the key problem is that obviously you really need to know that this is worthwhile, because it can even be dangerous, right? And so, Paris is Burning comes to mind. You can die being who you are because people don't accept it. And I think that is sort of something which in academia is just as true as it is sort of like in sort of like circumstances where people accept or not accept sort of particular expressions of like, if you're not an African American, but you have dreadlocks, for example, or if you are of a certain gender, but you express yourself in a different way. And that is also true in academia, only it's usually played out in the back room, right? Like, let me give an example. The Volkswagen Stiftung, if you applied for something that was complexity science, in the past, it had to have a mathematical model. you couldn't just observe bottom-up emergence of complexity and quantity, because this would be, quote unquote, just observation. And that is true for many sort of like panels in the natural sciences, while in the humanities, you wouldn't even get across the door by saying, I'm going to quantify X, right? Because they're just not going to do that. And I think these kind of situations, we can learn a lot from sort of like things that are theorized, because people sort of like, sort of like theorize it in a much more immediate manner. Because the whole sort of like transgender topic, for example, may seem marginal, but it's actually not, because people have literal skin in the game, while in academia, nobody has skin in the game for being sort of a mixture of an art historian, doing some sociophysics with some physicists, and computing too much, but not quite enough to be a digital humanist in the German informatics sense, for example. So these kind of like situations, I would encourage you to sort of like bring this in your book, for example, to a broader world, because people are not aware of this kind of thing. I mean, you can see this by the reaction, even for gender. People say, yeah, there's 2 buckets, shut up. And for academic disciplines, people do exactly the same thing, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting to ponder this in terms of not just academic disciplines, but also what we could call academic fashions and ways of doing things in academia. And I mean, of course, looking at ongoing developments, you just said that when we are couched in our academic disciplines, we have no skin in the game. People might disagree with that, yeah, because there are ways of doing academia which are in fact quite substantially threatened, marginalized, etc. I wouldn't have thought of bringing this together with Cringe, but I think your example of the doctoral candidate that you mentioned, that makes sense, so that we kind of look at academic trajectories and kind of ways of situating yourself in the work that you do, and of kind of comparing these dynamics to kind of the precariousness of Cringe judgments. Yeah, that I think that makes sense, and that is something interesting to think about further. Yeah.
Here's another aspect that fits well, but only marginally. You brought up gender in the change of sort of Cringe being like sort of like rooted in these sort of hypermasculine incel fora, and then sort of re-emerging, regendered in these sort of like interior design Tiger of Sweden like shops, where everything becomes feminized. What comes to my mind here is another longue durée kind of like gradient, which is the gradual feminization of angels in Christian iconography. So if you look at like really old depictions of, say, Archangel Michael, obviously a dude, and obviously typically very sort of, having a sword and fighting the devil and stuff like that. While throughout, particularly the 19th century, these depictions become ever more female. So they have a tunic, and at some point they literally have long hair, and then like they become ever more androgyne, and in the end they're basically female. Similar in Munich, which as you have shown a shop, you may be familiar, the so-called Münchner Kindl was a monk, and now it's sort of a female child representing the city of Munich with the same dress, which actually has no, like, it doesn't make sense whatsoever without knowing that this is actually the dress of a monk from medieval male sort of cloister culture. And I think holding the beer, because the monk obviously brewed the beer, and kids with beer are incompatible. So these kind of things are interesting, because they seem to be similar to a sort of like, particularly the aspect of like having this super toxic 4chan or whatever environment where Cringe sort of like is enacted, while at the end you have this sort of like, sort of funny, little bit too colorful interior design objects. This sounds very similar to a virus becoming less deadly over time, which happens to viruses. And so my question would be, is that a gradient or is it punctuated? Like, is it just happening? And is it like, you know, do we have different communities here, or is there an actual gradient going on?
Yeah, I mean, this specific example wasn't about Cringe, but about this specific construction of all the fields. And maybe the situation is a bit different or more specific here, because what I was pointing out is that in a certain sense, it was, I don't want to say unexpected, but it was a specific kind of situation and community to have this, all the fields with this kind of very, at times enthusiastic display of emotions. Yeah, so it's a kind of a funnel for the male participants of this hyper masculinized forum to kind of express solidarity, express friendliness, etc. And so in a way, this kind of migrating back to the touchy-feely domain of early childhood education and bridal dresses is maybe not so surprising, because this is the context in which stereotypically you would expect in a deeply gendered society references to exuberant feelings. Yeah, right. It's not just feelings, but it's all the feels. Yeah, so this kind of overwhelming, overpowering notion of affect. And so the fact that this has happened, and also funnily enough, at different places across the globe, but in similar manners, right? So this was not one chain that I showed with different outlets, but these are completely different enterprises. Probably shows how kind of the dimension of feeling gets kind of sucked back into these femininized spaces. I don't know if it takes away from these other usages of the construction. I just found it noteworthy and maybe not entirely surprising, but also kind of funny, to be honest. You know, the way this had worked over just a couple of years to bring all the feels back to these feminine spaces. Yeah.
This is a bridge to sort of something that goes back to the question of Mike. Is there sort of something to quantify? So even if there is sort of like, here we have this problem that linguistics has this discrete categories called words and stuff like that. But frequencies come gradually, right? And so one of the key questions, which your third sort of branch of theory in literature theory, like Sian Nhai, with her vernacular aesthetics sort of maybe brings in. So questioning aesthetic categories is one thing, but the question is even, are there categories, or is vernacular aesthetics actually much more granular phenomenon where sort of, for example, the engrams have multiple meanings attached to them, and that may be much more detailed than saying, oh, okay, it's once you got two words, they act as buckets and then they sort of like attract their meaning? Or is there something where we could have really an opportunity to sort of observe bottom-up emergence, where we say, oh, okay, so how much does fluctuate in and out? What's the noise here? And where does it actually come together and actually become something that similar to in fluid dynamics, where all of a sudden, you know, something that becomes a vortex is sort of a discernible node where there's some kind of stability in the system, even though the rest of the fluid is sort of moving turbulently. So is that something that we may have a chance, if you would have enough data, to actually observe? Can we see the turbulence, and can we see categories? And then do you imagine that there is a catalog of categories, or would it more be a gradient of things that are more or less categorical, basically?
I mean, the very terminology of vernacular aesthetics kind of implies that it must be a bottom-up phenomenon, yeah, or a bottom-up dynamic. And of course, or at least the way I understand it, this notion of vernacular aesthetics is, of course, a little bit of a playful kind of how can I put this, nudge in the direction of traditional literary theories of aesthetics, where aesthetic categories are anything but vernacular. Yeah, so this is precisely the point and the joke. But I have to say, from a sociolinguistic perspective, very much the on-point way of understanding these kinds of aesthetic categories need precisely that they come out of bottom-up community dynamics. How they emerge specifically, of course, that's another question. Yeah, but to give you one way of how this can be studied and how I think this should be studied, probably, and something that people have started doing or are on the brink of doing, is I mentioned in my second to last slide this adjective construction of X-core, yeah? So normcore, balletcore, gothcore, what have you, Barbiecore, tomatocore, etc. So this is what current digital linguistic practice describes as aesthetics, yeah? So if you ask young people, then they are going to say, yeah, aesthetics is when someone is Barbiecore, for example. Yeah, and so that is quite fascinating to me. And this is, I think, if we want one specific site to study these kinds of things, like how people think about aesthetics and what vernacular aesthetics might mean, that is the point to turn to, and that's a more recent understanding of aesthetics that Xian Nai I don't think was predicting, couldn't have anticipated, but that gels exactly with a lot of the things that she talks about in basically I guess all of her books, but certainly the two ones that I refer to. Yeah, and so actually I have to say this is something that I find a kind of exciting field to work in right now. So in general, so again, for my discipline, linguistics and rethinking linguistics through categories of the aesthetic and what it might mean to do a linguistics that pays attention to aesthetics in whichever way we understand it, right? Because what we have been concerned with in the past 50 years is, on the one hand, social variation and regional variation, and then things like social meaning, and maybe we have looked into the stuff that we call style, but we have kind of buffered against everything that has to do with any kind of aesthetic. And that is something that I think is going to change in the near future.
Thank you very much. This is really exciting. There's like three aspects of like, and maybe you can confirm this, like why I find this exciting. One is there is sort of a bridge between sort of like calling balletcore or cottagecore a style, an aesthetic. There's a bridge to computer science, which doesn't say, oh, there is impressionist style, but like if they say impressionist style, what they actually mean is like a pixel translation from Starry Night by Van Gogh. So there is a much smaller sort of like, you could say, a definition of the objective function, basically, if this was math. And so that is one I think really, really interesting notion here. And the other thing is that there is a sort of tension, like as you bring this up and what you call aesthetics, and you sort of like tie this to categories in linguistics. We actually recently had a paper, which is a data set, it's called the fruit salad, which has 10 fruits in 10 different styles. So there's 10 categories and 10 styles. And the idea is to measure, like basically you throw this data set into large language models, classified, and then you measure how it classifies. So you can actually disambiguate semantic categories, you may say linguistics, while versus on the other side, what we sort of like, from Eleanor Roche and Ludwig Wittgenstein have stolen as visual family resemblance, like the sort of residual visual aesthetics that you cannot grasp into sort of like categories. And I think that is a really, really important thing, because it seems like there is a sort of like what you're describing with balletcore and normcore, whatever, is yet another category that's neither sort of what a linguist would call or a database ontologist would call semantic category, nor is it sort of what an art historian would say, oh, this diffuse you know, this feels like Baroque, while this feels Rococo based on the 3 billion pictures I've seen, basically, right? And so that is a sort of really interesting thing. So there may actually indeed a new sort of vernacular definition of aesthetics emerging, similar to, you know, our notion of quantitative aesthetics, which is not equivalent to beauty, also is not equivalent to beauty, because there is this substantial heterogeneity in all these cores, basically. I think this is really, really cool to go into, and both in your way and in many other ways, in a sense.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Cool. Any other questions from the audience? I don't know how to ask my questions alone. I have one. Jugendwort des Jahres is by itself cringe, is it?
Certainly so. Yeah, this is a yes, basically.
So did they thematize that while giving cringe the title Jugendwort des Jahres, or?
I mean, let me bring her up here. For people who are familiar with the German kind of discursive setting in which this happens, here she is. Susanne Daubner, as one of the exposed anchor women of the Tagesschau, this was an attempt to kind of capture the layers of cringe in these performances, right? So this was done with the awareness of when we engage in these nominations and elections and talk about youth word practices, this is kind of not just embarrassing, but also yeah, I don't want to say fake. I mean, the linguistic take on this has been, of course, that there's all kinds of problems with these elections and these competitions. But I think what you see here is that there is a certain appropriation of the discourse that already tries to capitalize on this, you know, multi-layered self-awareness of the cringe and embarrassing status of it. Whether it works, we may be of different opinions, at least for a certain while. These little clips here, and as you can see in the Susanne Daubner case, this was a clip made for social media at that point for Instagram, then later for TikTok. They were kind of, yeah, successful in terms of circulation. But as I said, I think even this kind of remediation has had its moment, which has come and gone. Yeah. So again, that's a yes, with taking into account that the people who do this kind of commodification are aware, at least to a certain degree, of the awkwardness of the whole process. Yeah.
I just want to mention this as a side note. Do you see that these three images sort of like are resonant with each other in terms of color spectrum, which I think, if I remember well, was sort of the year before there was a Pantone color of the year, which was the first time they actually gave it to two colors, which is exactly sort of this sort of like bluish and pinkish, which is interesting because that itself is also a mediated process that's also cringe and in a sense doesn't take into account what people sort of like do themselves on the street, right? So there's sort of like the public aesthetics, and very much Tagesschau as a sort of national news broadcast is very much sort of something that is very much locked into this sort of like pre-designed sort of like iconography that then is not really broad audience iconography in a similar, and now we get back to how we started this conversation, you know, basically Titel, Thesen, Temperamente, choosing somebody who's completely cringe. It's interesting because it's not coming out of society. There's a very clear sort of boundedness in this kind of selection process. And I think that would be an interesting thing where longue durée wise, can this type of research sort of like go after these phenomena where if you delabel the word cringe with, okay, there's a placeholder, is there a certain, are we observing a certain function of societal interaction where after time we find different sort of like objects that fill that niche, so to speak. And then the question is there, like, how has it been filled in the past? And what I'm always interested in is, we have this online situation, we have the mass media situation in the 20th century, we have the newspaper print situation in the 19th century, but then you can go all the way back to sketchbooks and like manuscripts being sort of like exchanged and stuff like that, or clay tablets where you may have the same process in a way slower fashion, but maybe if you know what the quantitative pattern is, we may be able to identify, even in this really old material, sort of similar things, which for visual iconography is totally possible. You can sort of like, for example, if you look at the volatility of depictions of Homer's Odyssey in Greek vases before and after the actual redaction as it is written down and is canonized, there's a really interesting thing, obviously, because you can see in different areas sort of people reacting in different ways, and Etruscans have a different idea about the same iconography than maybe Greeks in Athens. And that may be similar to sort of what's going on in Fort John versus Tiger of Sweden shops, right? And so that is sort of something which I think art history and probably also literature history have taken sort of like, so far as I observe, and I may not observe hard enough here, sort of an easy out by sort of saying, I do old stuff, or I only do new stuff, but this sort of like connection where it's really not like a before and after, but it's really a gradient. It's sort of something which is sort of missing, and where this is one of the reasons we call, in this project, it was called cultural data analytics, but why I, for example, I'm super cautious with the word digital, because I mean, there may be analog computation. It is easy cop out for people who consider themselves traditional, right? When we actually talk about the same phenomena. And would you agree with that, or would you say there's really something new going on?
Yeah, I was thinking some people talk nowadays about everything being post-digital, to kind of get out of this conundrum. I mean, I've hinted at this. I tend to be very skeptical of all claims to newness and recency as they relate to digital culture. I think that in a very manifest way, there is such a thing as digital linguistic practice, or broadly understood digital practice, but I would never make very bold claims about, everything is different, everything is new and recent in digital culture. This is part of my little joke with longue durée, is exactly this idea that there are reverberations and recyclings rather, and resemiatizations, or whatever you want to call them, than kind of genuinely new things, right? With regard to what you pointed out about these three images here, my hunch about the color coding is that this is more coincidence and is based on the specific brands that they are standing for. So like you have the light blue of the Langenscheidt publishing house, and obviously you have the color scheme of the Tagesschau. But of course, in clipping these three together here, I mean, I did not do this by coincidence, and it does not escape us that there would be many things to look into here with regard to embodiment, body language, and also apparel and accessoires. Basically, it's most obvious in the elderly woman in the Langenscheidt ad, but the e-scooter in the right-hand side picture, and the kind of linguistic adornment with the word cringe in the Susanne Daubner one. I mean, there is obvious visual parallels going on here, which I don't think are entirely coincidental, but could be very well kind of analyzed in a visual multimodal way. Yeah.
I have to admit, my question was sparked by the fact that Jan Böhmermann, the guy on the right, for those who don't know him, he's sort of like the John Oliver of Germany, I guess. He's totally not coincidental with the use of color. Like, he has things where throughout episodes, he would change the color of the entire set and all the things on the table to sort of like make clear what's going on in the political story, whatever. So that is sort of like what brought that up. And indeed, I think for Langenscheidt, yeah, the blue-green may be coincidental, but the rest is not, I'm pretty sure. And so this is sort of really interesting thing, yeah. We hit almost the 2-hour mark. We can take one more question. Who's up? Okay, Jan has a question. Wait.
I agree and disagree with you, Max, on the terms that, first of all, like going back in time and looking at the all sorts of cringe stuff, we might find that there is a whole gradient of cringiness and relationship to that. But it feels like in times of digital, the polarization of cringiness is actually what is increasing. So things are more commonly either cringe or non-cringe. And this is, I think, the part of the social where we have to relate to a specific group. We're like, social media puts us in a situation where you constantly in a social environment and you have to claim what side of the seat you belong to. Like you belong to the people who are cringe or who are not cringe.
Well, I'm not sure about saying that things become less ambivalent, or that it is clear, you know, that there are clear demarcations of what is cringe and what is not cringe. But you point to one issue that goes with, if you remember my timeline, with the middle part, namely the emergence of what has been called the social web, social media, etc. One thing that we are constantly steeped in digital discourse of all kind is incentives to rate things and to comment on things and to affiliate ourselves with certain practices or disaffiliate ourselves with other practices. Yeah, so this is something that isn't just kind of there, but which is very much at least part of the building principle of social media, that you have like buttons, that you have share buttons, that you can basically react and comment on anything. Yeah, so you can I don't know, I can rate my hairdresser and write a comment to my hairdresser, and so the logics of much of social media is to nudge you towards kind of positioning yourself towards things and affiliating yourselves with things. And so this has been interpreted as one very strong dynamic, which doesn't mean that cringe is something kind of genuinely digital, but where digital practice and digital culture brings this to the fore with great ease, yeah? And also, of course, makes it countable, makes it quantifiable, and in this sense, makes it accessible for social science research, yeah? Which is one reason why we kind of pick on it and say, oh yeah, that's something we can analyze because it's so nicely countable, yeah? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Super cool. Let me thank you, and also sort of like lead to my little binge watching pitch to the next talk. You started with or the second chapter was the effective turn, which you made a sort of case for like comparing this to performance, and something that has also been called the performative turn. As you also sort of like mentioned, there's so many turns, but I think actually indeed the two mother turns, the linguistic turn, sort of more right-wing turn of Richard Rorty, and the pictorial turn, the more left-wing turn of William T.J. Mitchell, focusing on visual stuff, they're both substantial. Like, so they actually look at substance, meaning text and images, which is very much in line with what cultural fields and art history, anthropology, and so on do. We look at objects, we look at images, we look at texts, we look at architecture and so on. But there's one major turn, which indeed I think is really, really, really substantial. And it did not happen around 2000 with network science, but actually happened around 1910, which is the turn from substance to function, which is sort of, I think, one could say the affective turn, performative turn, and so on are expressions of this kind of like notion that we need to look at the interaction, we need to look at the sort of function over time and actual generating mechanisms, which is actually what you do in a really, really neat way. So you do sociolinguistics, which is about people and words, but actually the whole research story is about sort of like what's actually the function of those and the interaction of those. And in this vein, our next talk has a very sort of like poignant title. It's called The Physics of Communication by Carl Friston from, I think, the University of London. And so this is like basically taking us to the other extreme of cultural data analytics, which is cool, in sort of like the symphony, where on the one hand, today we have seen sort of the very concrete application of these kind of like socio-linguistic methods to concrete material, all the way to the other end, where one could say, can there be something like a mathematical theory, applied math physics of communication? And so we hope to welcome sort of as many viewers as possible in the next episode. And today, thank you very much, Theresa. This was really, really awesome and super inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and for the discussion. And yeah, good luck with the lecture series for the rest of the semester. And
thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.